it's a genocide.
It's not genocide.
Later.
It is a genocide.
Really? Who cares? Does it even matter anymore? I know there are millions of people out there, Muslims and non-Muslims, who are excited, hopeful because South Africa has dragged Israel to the International Court of Justice and are now pinning their hopes on the ICJ to finally find Israel guilty of genocide and also stopping the ongoing violence in Gaza. However, what if I was to tell you that sadly, there is no point in pinning your hopes on the ICJ and getting too carried away? In this video, I will give you my top 6 reasons as to why this ICJ ruling won't change anything in Palestine. If you want to hear me out, then stick around. Before that, if you are new to the channel, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button on this video. Your support is greatly appreciated. Alhamdulillah. I also want to add though, don't get me wrong, I'm not taking anything away from the South African effort in taking Israel to the ICJ, accusing it of genocide. Credit where it's due, and at least the South Africans have made a stand against the crimes of Israel, and kudos to them. Just compare this to the actions of the so-called Muslim regimes. Yeah, we'll save that one for another time. So reason number 1, the result or the ruling by the ICJ could take years to be decided. How does that change the reality on the ground? How's that going to stop the genocide, ethnic cleansing from occurring in Gaza and even in the West Bank? So that's my reason number 1. It doesn't change the reality on the ground. Now, so I may rightfully point out that South Africa has requested for a provisional order, a measure for the violence in Gaza to stop immediately. And if this request was granted, it would be binding. Okay, well, this leads me to my reason number 2. And my reason number 2 is that the ICJ has no power to enforce this. So even though the ruling would be binding, there is no enforcement mechanism. So this provisional order to immediately stop the violence is only as good as the paper it's written on. It's like a paper tiger. There are so many examples of this, but check out the ICJ versus Russia, versus Myanmar, and even versus the United States. They ordered the violence, the genocide to stop, but this fell on deaf ears and they couldn't do anything about it. So do you think Israel is just going to comply? How many UN resolutions has Israel violated? One example goes back all the way to December 1948, when the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194, in which it demanded the unconditional return of refugees and their families to their homeland. How did that one work out? In Ilan Pape's book, 10 Myths About Israel, he mentions that during the Nakba,
in a matter of 7 months, 531 villages were destroyed and 11 urban neighborhoods emptied. The mass expulsion was accompanied by massacres, rape, and the imprisonment of males over the age of 10 in labor camps for periods of over a year.
He goes on to include so many other events that the list is too long to include in this video, but I'm sure you get the picture. And another key point to note is that the ICJ is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, the UN. Yes, the same UN which declared the Zionist settler state in the first place in 1948. So here we're talking about UN resolutions going back 75 years, crimes going back 75 years, but has Israel ever been held accountable and punished for these heinous crimes? Just turn on the TV and we will see they have been committing a genocide in broad daylight through their statements and actions, and they have done this with impunity, which leads me nicely onto reason number 3. So reason number 3 is that Israel is untouchable in the current world order as long as it serves the US strategic interests. Have you ever wondered why the US and the West stand by Israel through their unequivocal support? Well, alhamdulillah, I recorded a video on this very topic and you can go and watch it by clicking on the link above. However, to explain briefly, the reason why Israel goes about its business with so much impunity is because it is a strategic asset for the US. I'm sure you've all heard Joe Biden's famous words.
It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
So the reason why Israel gets away scot-free every time is because the US will not allow their strategic interests in the region to be damaged in any way whatsoever. So the reason why Israel seems to be immune to UN resolutions or the wrath of the international community or international based order is because the US always has its back. Or rather, shall I say, the US always has its own back. And this leads me on to reason number 4. So reason number 4, the ICJ settles disputes between states in accordance with international law. Yes, the very same international law which has become apparent to the world as being a bad joke, a fallacy, and in fact something that is only used by the powerful few as a stick to beat others with. So the ICJ is linked to the same international law which has been on vacation for the last 3 months. There have been so many violations of international law by the Israelis over the last 3 months, and yet most Western nations are still claiming that Israel has a right to defend itself. It has the right to turn off electricity, deprive people of food and water. The concepts of international law, international community, and so on have been fully exposed to the world. So why should we expect anything positive to come from a court which settles disputes based on the same international law? What value does this court have, and what value would any decision carry? And reason number 5, the nations who formed the UN, who formed the ICJ, introduced the concept of international law, are the first to bypass, ignore, violate international law when it suits their interests. So even if the ICJ conclude that indeed Israel carried out a genocide, do you think that will make even an iota of difference? The West has always allowed Israel to operate with impunity, violating UN resolutions, breaching international law, and we really think a court ruling will change all of this? Reason number 6, we have to understand that this is a battle between civilizations. This is more than just about a piece of land, apartheid, oppression. This is a battle between Western civilization and the civilization of Islam, Western values and the values of Islam. Just look at how the West responded to the events of October the 7th. The way many of the Western leaders rushed off to show solidarity with the Israelis, how they sent their warships, weapons, and how the Western media pushed the narrative of the battle between good and evil. Just look at what they openly say, like the Dutch politician Geert Wilders, who said that
if Jerusalem falls into the hands of the Muslims, Athens and Rome will be next. Thus Jerusalem is the main front protecting the West. It is not a conflict over territory, but rather an ideological battle between the mentality of the liberated West and the ideology of Islamic barbarism.
Even Donald Trump recently said,
"The United States and Israel represent the pinnacle of Western civilization, which is exactly what these people want to destroy."
There are so many quotes like these, so blatant, but we seem to either miss these or ignore them. But getting back to the crux of reason number 6, which is the battle between civilizations. Which civilization does international law emanate from? Which civilization does the United Nations belong to? The framework that the UN and international law work within, which civilization does that framework belong to? In fact, which civilization does international law and the United Nations serve? Anyways, I'm sure you get the picture, right? So there you have it, people. These are my top 6 reasons why we, the Ummah, and I would even include non-Muslims here, shouldn't get carried away with the genocide case brought to the ICJ by South Africa. However, it's not all doom and gloom. The one positive I take from South Africa's case against Israel is further exposing the reality of this racist, white supremacist, settler, colonialist entity to the rest of the world. Not only them, it exposes those who support this genocide in Gaza. So it definitely helps in exposing the false narrative which has been prevalent for many, many decades. Probably less so for Muslims than non-Muslims, but it's important for the non-Muslim world, especially those living in the West, to see how hypocritical, how rotten their Western civilization is. Capitalism, liberalism, secularism, freedoms, human rights, and hopefully they will start to look elsewhere for answers, inshallah ta'ala. So ultimately, to wrap things up, as Muslims, we should always look towards Islam for the solution, the treatments for problems. These problems could range from how to make masa over our socks, a domestic issue between a husband and a wife, and the occupation of Muslim lands. Islam has the answer to all of these issues. What the last 3 months has demonstrated to Muslims, and I would also argue to non-Muslims, is that the international setup is exactly that, a setup to serve the capitalists at the expense of all others, especially Muslims. The world has seen the hypocrisy of the West, international law, the UN, and now need to look towards something else to bring about peace, justice, and order in the world. As Muslims, of course, we must look towards the practical implementation of Islam as being the solution, as a genuine alternative to the hypocrisy, fallacy of capitalism, liberalism, and secularism. So we shouldn't be naive in believing that we will receive justice through South Africa's efforts at the ICJ. It's all part of the same show. So we have to be more switched on. As the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the believer is not stung from the same hole twice. So my brothers and sisters, it's time we stopped exhausting our efforts and activism through the very nations and international structures that created Israel and permits its crimes. It's time we, as an ummah, stop looking towards any other system, criterion for the solutions to our problems, and started looking towards Islam as our sole basis, the sole guidance on how we deal with the problems we face in life, not just as individuals, but also as an ummah. We should view the situation in Palestine as being a symptom rather than the problem itself. In the same way, what's happening in Kashmir, in Sudan, in Syria, and so on, these are all symptoms of the same problem, which is the absence of the Islamic system, the Sharia on this earth. Hence, we are without the practical implementation of the solutions Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided us to deal with our problems. So surely the focus of all Muslims must be to take part in the work to bring about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen in whatever capacity they are able to do so. But of course, it goes without saying, this will take effort on our part. However, it's the only way to not only transform, change the situation of the ummah for the better, but rather the situation, the condition of the entire world. As we know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they work to change themselves. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding us to work to change our situation, and then Allah will change our situation. And of course, before I end, I promised that I would explain why I personally don't care or think it matters whether what Israel is doing in Gaza is internationally recognized as being a genocide or not. Look, I feel that too many of us get caught up in the debate of whether it's a genocide or it isn't a genocide, rather than focusing on stopping the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the slaughter. In just 3 months, between 20 to 30,000 Muslims have been killed. At least half of those are women and children, if not more. 85% of the entire population has been displaced. Most don't even have a home to go back to, even if they were allowed to. The health system has been destroyed, schools destroyed, mosques destroyed, and the list goes on. This is the reality. This has happened. This is happening. So on the grand scheme of things, what does it matter whether people call it a genocide, a mass murder, or a friggin' falafel tea party? It doesn't change the reality on the ground. Okay, so there you have it, my top 6 reasons as to why people, and especially Muslims, shouldn't pin their hopes on what's going to happen at the ICJ and shouldn't get too carried away with South Africa's efforts in bringing attention to the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? I would love to know, inshallah. So please leave a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Until the next one, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.